Okay, so Cabra Sota Soze. This is the talk I'm giving in T2 in Helsinki next month, and it's slowly becoming less painful to hear, hopefully, for those of you who are reviewing it. I think, one of the key things I realized as I was going through it is that, as with all keynotes, you don't really know what you're talking about till you do the keynote a few times. And one of the things I wanted to demonstrate was almost this lack of existence of where the policy world is versus where it thinks it is. And we sort of live in this bizarre world of clouds and mirrors. And I think, especially since probably everyone in the room in T2 is going to be one of the usual suspects, there's going to be a lot of personal context around it. But before I go into where I've been for the past few years, I want to talk a little bit about personal history because I think required to, even though in theory people who are coming to T2 are very technical and would kind of know who Immunity is and who I am. But it turns out the community is big enough that it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, there's going to be a huge set of new people who have no idea who you are or what you've done. So I quite enjoyed when this happened online recently, and I was like, what did you find out about me, new person? And he said, I think people like you, but apparently you write a lot of trolly posts. And my coworkers say that's entirely 100% accurate. Okay. But part of the reason I haven't been as technical lately is because I've had a sort of deep dive into the septic system that is sort of United States cyber policy community. It's also the world's cyber policy community a little bit, but much more the United States. And I think part of that's because, like with all of us, you get such a deep perspective on the technical stuff and you kind of can see the future a little bit. And that's how I felt after leaving the NSA, is that there was like this ability, since you've worked on stuff that eventually people will come out on, you can see the future, but at some point you want to change it as well. So that's where I felt with the policy world. And as a hacker, you kind of go into it with a blind spot. But after doing it for a number of years, I've realized that there's sort of like these vulnerability classes, sort of like time of check to time of use or race condition, but much more local to what the policy world is. And one of them that I think is endemic is just assuming that all data and execution is just bound to a physical spot and happens at a physical point. And probably the next most common one is wishing for the impossible. If only there was a technical differentiator between good and bad code, then we could, and then they write an entire paper, right? So I've gone to meeting after meeting where they start it with that, and then they write like an entire tree of decisions based on that idea, and then you're like, but there's no way to do that, and they get really mad at you. They're like, well, that just means the technical people have to work harder. And I'm like, okay. And then the other one that you see is really trying to build grand principles of agreement between countries or organizations and doing it in sort of very legalistic language, trying to base their theory on international law, instead of doing it the way a computer science person would do it, which is we're going to essentially write an RFC and then implement it in some code and then see how it works in the real world and iterate on that. So you see these three flaws present in the international system. And anytime anyone in the policy world starts giving you some stuff, you can just run this quick checklist through it, and then you'll find a way where they're like about to run themselves off a cliff. And I can give you a couple examples, some of which you're probably very familiar with. Finland is a member of the Wassenaar arrangement. And unfortunately, this is how I entered the policy world. Was I had a meeting with a very angry member of the Commerce Department who was saying, look, your entire field is about to change. We're about to basically erase it. There's really not much you can do about it. So just thought we would let you know ahead of time in case you had some comments. And what happened was instead the entire field got organized and protested against it in the United States. And the experience in the United States was vastly different from the experience in the rest of the world, which does a lot more discretionary prosecution, shall we say. In the United States, we try to play a little bit more by the rules, And although I'm sure that those in Europe would say that we don't, but regardless, maybe it's just a matter of scale. But cyber things, because they can't be described in functional terms, which is another way of saying code has no intent, has resulted in a mismatch of resistance, and you don't actually have any kind of implementation of the Wassenaar arrangement cyber things in the United States, which means the whole thing is kind of meaningless, which I think was probably not what they thought was going to happen when they started rolling it forward. You can see a very similar failure here with, Michel Markov, who, all these people are very smart and have lived in this world, and the world has changed under them, and they write these things where they're just like, I just don't understand what happened. And what happened was, you can't create cyber norms in the sort of international law framework. You either create code and implement that code with your close partners and then later with your adversaries, or you don't. And so when all this stuff fell apart because none of it meant anything, the cyber norms community was sort of astonished. They really were, even though it was completely predictable if you knew kind of the root causes behind it. And they're not getting these root causes because all the places they go for advice are giving them bad advice because they don't know what they're talking about. And Belfer's kind of the, very obvious example. It's the kind of think tank that you would go to. They've got a bunch of people, ex-government, whatever, especially after the Obama administration went out and Trump came in. As you can imagine, there were a lot of people who thought they were going to get jobs in the Hillary administration who all of a sudden did not have jobs. So all these think tanks filled up very quickly. And, they ended up... There's a weird thing with these think tanks, which is that they often try to take an international law policy student and then just write cyber papers with them. But they don't really know, even if once you get a PhD in international law and policy and cyber policy, you don't really understand vulnerabilities, which boggles the mind, but that's true. And so, I ended up taking a couple days to look at one of the recent papers, which claimed that Chrome had a huge rediscovery rate, which is a bit like claiming that the climate's actually cooling down quite a lot, and we should really be careful of, global climate cooling. They had to retract their paper, and they wrote a big thing. Oh, we screwed up. Of course they screwed up. And why did they screw up, though? It's sort of like, this keeps happening over and over. I'm not the only one reviewing these papers. And just to give you another example, cross-site scripting, defacing web pages. But where does this stuff come from? And it comes from this idea that, the universities were going to be the font of new ideas and sort of thought leadership in any of these new domains, because that was completely true for the past three. And what's true now is it's this sort of scraggly band of vermin, right? So there's a big disconnect between, it doesn't mean that universities and academics aren't doing good work. It's just not where the font of the ideas are coming from. It's not where the best work is getting done. It's not where you're seeing the sort of nexus of innovation. So that wasn't true in the past, right? So, you have all of these systems set up to sort of funnel their policy from academia and sort of drive that way, but they're getting all the sort of wrong input. So it's not their fault, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I wanted to show you a quick example. If you look at all the work that's been done in NATO, it's all wrong. I'm just going to state it straight up. Actually, I've worked a little bit with NATO on some of this stuff, but the key fallacy of sovereign territory applying to cyberspace is just rife with all these things, because it all comes from lawyers who have never written an exploit, and they don't really understand that data and code are the same thing, and what access versus execution versus read versus write permissions are. And so what you get is this, they'll build it, the very first chapter of the Tallinn documents, which is where they all came together and wrote their sort of maybe Kama Sutra or Talmud of cyberspace international law. So they immediately make the mistake of thinking that, okay, well, if we have physical repair of a hard drive, then, and that hard drive is in a location, then that's when international law and the laws of war come into play. and it just goes just straight off the rails from the first chapter. And all these guys have IQs of like 250, so when it goes off the rails, it really just keeps going basically into space in a straight line. And it's because they don't really understand the basics of. They're still in sort of a Newtonian physics of cyber, and they're a little behind on just the concept that, you know, data locality is nonsense in a way, and everywhere that it touches law, there's a huge frictional bug, and you can exploit those bugs in different ways in the policy space. And the only way I have a good analogy for it is trying to teach people quantum mechanics, which is a pretty bad way to do things, it turns out, because they either know it or they don't, and they just feel upset either way. But it's sort of like, even when you draw the probability density of an electron, they try to draw it as discrete dots, and it's not. That's the thing. It's not in one of those places. It's in all of those places. It is the probability density. That's what an electron is. It's not this orbiting ball that you may or may not catch in any particular place. And that's an impossible concept to get to someone if they haven't, I guess, really delved into it deeply. And so everywhere that, you know, the lack of locality of cyber domains is rife within all of policy. And that's something that I learned the hard way as a hacker trying to sort of enter the community. And, you know, explaining to, you know, people with PhDs in cyber policy that, you know, our species has just changed. You know, there's a history and a prehistory, and we thought prehistory was when we started writing books, but it turns out prehistory was, you know, before Facebook. That's basically the truth. Every time I take a picture that's not recorded in history, if I want to look at like a picture of my car from 1997 when I was working at the NSA, I have to dig through some old paper, which I inevitably have lost. That's prehistory. It's gone. So tough concepts, and because of those tough concepts, we've now tried to define cyber weapons and how cyber power is projected incorrectly. And not understanding it means you get beat. And getting beat by Julian Assange over and over and over is very embarrassing, and yet no one seems to want to correct their thought to change it. But I tried to, like many years ago, my whole company talks about this kind of thing a lot, and we tried to find different ways to categorize what we considered cyber weapons. And, you know, we have this sort of access, analyze, remove, offer criteria, where you say you have an organization that offers the ability to access information that you didn't have before, sort of a reflection of the CIA triad, right? So you have confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but what if you turn that around so we can either remove things from the internet, or we can offer things to the internet that you can't remove, which we also think is a very important cyber weapon. And it's really no accident that cyber weapon was put together by hackers, right? Like, if you look at the people involved in WikiLeaks, they're real hackers. That's the thing about it. So cyber weapons, I mean, it's sort of tautological. I can't pronounce any words, but, you know, cyber weapons are the things hackers create to conduct war, and that's what these things are. So I just want to try to broaden people's minds with this stuff, because otherwise they think only about exploits, they think only about access, and they get beat. And I want to avoid that. And part of the reason I'm trying to avoid that is to look at who's doing it and why, and the strategic framework around it. And, you know, the thing about evolution and most things is that if you just look around you, it's kind of right there, right? Like, in a sense, when something doesn't make any sense to you because your current framework doesn't predict things properly, then it means you're missing part of the science. And part of the science of cyber war that we are missing is that it's mostly done by non-state actors, that state actors have taken a back seat. And, you know, if you go back into your history and you look with different eyes, you see a completely different story, a completely different historical record. So if you look at LulzSec, first of all, I think you may not know as much about LulzSec as you think, but there really was nothing to stop them. I remember them going on for a long time. If you go and look at the actual Official LulzSec begin and end, it's about a month. They did like 30 days or 45 days of hacking or something like that. I don't think they were, like, they weren't really hacktivists. They were what we call reverse hacktivists. And if you were to do this today with slightly better OPSEC, what would ever stop you? And I like trying to get that. I mean, the FBI is like, we would stop them. And I hope they would, right? Because it's an annoying thing to have on the internet. I mean, that much pompous crap is just a painful thing to watch. But the reality is that I don't know that they would be stopped if they did it again, assuming, it was a different team. And then, of course, if you look at the kind of capabilities Google offers with, their attribution lately has been better than DHS's. Their ability to write exploits is top line. They have access to data that would allow them to do the kind of analysis that would disrupt covert activity for almost any country in the world, and serious levels of disruption. I think people underestimate what they could do. And we go on and on about the Russians manipulating the election. Imagine if Google wanted to, just for fun. Imagine one person at Google wanted to. Could they do it? Could they do it covertly? And I think they could, and we don't take them seriously. So the other side of that story is, are there organizations, maybe not nation states, but are just organizations that we traditionally thought of as strong, essential parts of our culture, that are really quite weak from the cyber domain? And I think the judicial system's one of them. The Roman Catholic Church is another one. I think certain companies definitely are. The supply chain that is Linux, obviously the DNC was a weak member of this little cohort. And so I think it's interesting that we haven't really got a theory of weakness, of real vulnerability. We have a theory of risk because it's all tied to money in our heads. Even the language they use to define your risk is based on credit card records. How many records were stolen? How much personal information was in the OPM hack or in the, whatever the hack of the day is, right? But that's not what defines breaking an organization. If I want to break an organization, I do it a completely different way. You do it the way the Russians kind of did it, with the sort of a debugger level feedback loop on an organization as you release their private information and control what they see and control how they act. And you do that with covert access, which is hacking, which is the fun part in most of our eyes. So I think that's the way we are. And the reason we're kind of like that is we've started this community, the community of technologists, thinks of things in a really different language and a really different cultural perspective than the law and policy teams, which have never read Snow Crash, have never read Cryptonomicon or Neuromancer or really Dune, any of the books that you've read that get you to the ability to run these kinds of operations, essentially information operations, they haven't read. And I think reading all these things is less about, these things influenced us and we sort of build them, right? We're like, oh, well, this is how you build this kind of tool set and this kind of worm, how you use it. We can imagine it in our heads. So that's an interesting point in terms of how do I predict what's coming next? Because, if I try to explain to people that nation states don't necessarily have to be the primary actors, it's hard to do without mentioning Snow Crash, because otherwise it's unimaginable. Hackback is probably the primary. A big article came out today on Hackback, actually. But everyone's like, well, there's a global deterrence against Hackback. They're like, it's illegal. And therefore, it's not going to be a big part of the strategic picture. And I'm like, well, of course it is, because there's a high chance of getting caught. If a prosecutor detects you doing it, if like U.S. Steel hacked China Steel, I'm sure a U.S. prosecutor would jump on that. And it's impossible for them to get offensive talent. And of course, your nation state's already perfectly protecting you. Except none of those things are true. And you kind of look at it and you're like, well, there's really an incentive for anyone with resources to be investing in Hackback, except they're going to do it in a way that, they think is legally acceptable. And part of that's because they don't think of themselves as belonging to any one country. So I don't know. There's things you can predict by looking at things without pretense, and that's one of them. And we like to talk a lot about defensive talent shortages, and just not enough people to look at all those IDS logs over and over and over again. But since many of us in the room are going to be offensive, I like to think of it as sort of what are the offensive talent structures? What does the fabric look like? And Doug Song, who was himself a member of WooWoo, apparently calls himself true neutral. And he put this little chart together as a sort of Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart. Again, another thing that I have trouble explaining to policy team people. With a little Edward Snowden up there, a little NSA on the other side of Edward Snowden, which makes a little bit of sense. And so I just think it's interesting. He starts classifying these things in this standard Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart. And it's also interesting who he chose to pick for this. But we almost, in my head, we look at it, and I guess because I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you sort of get a perspective for how they organize their structures, and they think of it as just a straight-up lineage. Just like, this guy taught that guy who liked to do this kind of technique, therefore all his students pretty much like to do that kind of technique, which is kind of true, right? So you can kind of see this sort of happen, except when it reaches a certain point, things get all mixed-matched because everyone's learning off the internet. But Valente does things differently from, Holes Gracie. But what are the lineages in offensive cyber talent, right? And I don't want to call out too many people unless you have a Wikipedia page, and that's why this sort of section was really hard to write. But, I would say TISO is one of the clear lineages, Synergy, like a bunch of other groups I could name but won't. And they'd write their exploits and even look for particular vulnerabilities in a really different way, which I found fascinating. And then even operationally, they're different. There's a lot of different lineages. And if you're thinking of it in terms of the other perspective, you're realizing that most of the top tier hackers in the world are not with nation states and never really were. And you wonder, so there's sort of a style to different nation states, but that's just one of many styles. It's like saying, there's a karate school over there, but then there's the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school over there, and they go about things completely differently, but equally effectively, perhaps. And the terminology is different, the types of implants they use, what targets they choose, and their value systems. And you can kind of project where they're going to go and how they operate in the current, what I like to call the metagame of the internet. Against a particular set of defenses, how would the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style of hacking work, and what are the advantages and what sort of compromises are they going to have to make? It's like when you change the rule set in MMA, certain things are better and certain things are worse. Maybe it's better to be a boxer, or not as good to be a boxer because you've got the glove size that's different. So that's the sort of strategic analysis that you're, I guess, not going to see coming out of the policy teams. But you should think about it yourself. And one of the things you're not going to see is red teams. Policy people do not like to analyze their own work. But how would you predict election hacking ahead of time? How would you say, what is the strategic target for Russia to hit the United States? And how would they do that? And what are the costs of it? And how do I project into this? And so I think Twitter is a strategic target. And this is how I would do it if I was a team. I would say, okay, well, here's what I'm going to have Donald Trump post. These are fake posts, but this is what I would have him post. And, how much would it cost to run that operation, right? So if you're the United States government, this is the kind of work you should be doing. Do you have the people to do it? Do your adversaries have the people to do it? What's the cost of failure? How do I make the cost of failure go up? And how do I increase the percentage of failure as a deterrence mechanism, which is the basic, I guess, principle of deterrence, which we seem to have forgotten. And then how do I run this operation for maximum effect? When is it going to happen that I think, when do I have to turn up the code or code yellow or whatever it is that we've decided to do in cyberfit space? And the other side of the picture is cyber persistence is all about supply chains. And, The Ukrainians got hacked with an accounting firm, which was very predictable. I think buying Twitter's, what was it, $32 billion? It's expensive, but it's for what you get, I think it'd be totally worth it, right? There's no reason you couldn't buy it, as Finland, I guess. The Russians probably could buy it. They'd have to go through Sisyphus, but the reality is that you start looking for these acquisition targets as your method of persistence in the supply chain, because the supply chain is sort of a ball of yarn. You don't necessarily know what you're going to need a year from now, so you need to be in a bunch of different places, and that's something that realistically you can do with money and not necessarily always around hackers. And I wanted to give unwanted and annoying advice to Finland about alliances. If you do your research, obviously. Well, if you read Wikipedia, I don't know if that counts as research. I just thought the phrasing was really funny. The unusual situation of being for, then against, then for the overall interests of the Allied powers. And alliances are really complex things. They really are. And you also can read about Finland's cyber defense and what balance they're trying to keep between open and closed in terms of where they want people to think their projected power capability is. Everyone starts off by pretending they're completely idiotic and have no idea what they're doing because they want to be underestimated. And then later on, they're like, man, we got to actually show we can do this stuff so people take us seriously, and they go the whole other way. And that's how all countries are. So, we just can't get it going. But I think alliances make a lot of sense, and they don't have to be with people nearby. Makes more sense to be with people who are kind of in the same technological space as you, but share no borders or national interest, really. And so Japan is a very interesting alliance partner potentially for Finland. And the other one is India, of course, which is the glue for almost every country in most other countries. So even though they aren't necessarily, the ones with the label on it, they definitely glue it together. Just some ideas. Because, of course, the other idea is to get straight up in bed with one of the big technology companies, often American. There's some things to do here that that wouldn't necessarily make it a Finnish company, obviously, but could really, I think, benefit both parties. Obviously Miami went through a little bit of a storm recently, and so did a lot of other places. And if you look at what storms do and how sort of unavoidable they are at some level, I think Floridians were shooting at the storm to try to stop it. That doesn't work, but it's just as useful as perhaps the vulnerability equities process. The way I sort of like at any tree that fell down during Irma in Miami, realistically was not meant for Miami. There's a certain truth to that. And if you look at how palm trees handle things, they do take some damage, but they have a level of resilience. And resilience in cyberspace is not about necessarily hunting. People want to get all over this idea we're going to hunt the hackers out of our system because that's what makes the most money, but is the least scalable. The reality is what you're going to do is have collectors that go to anomaly detection and then automatically tear down and rebuild bits of your infrastructure as you go. And it's going to happen kind of without you even knowing it happening and be pretty annoying all the time. But not too annoying, but pretty annoying. But the thing is, this is really the only thing as an attacker that I'm really even slightly worried about. And we're not quite ready for it yet. I know there's various teams starting to build things around this, but it's very hard to sell to a company. Yeah, we might turn off your web server for a few minutes and then start it up somewhere else on a completely different infrastructure without you even knowing why we did it. In fact, there'll be no way to say why we did it because anomaly detection is like that. And then from the offensive perspective, we're probably going to see lots of worms. The age of worms that made trusted computing happen at Microsoft is back. And there's no other way to say it. It was worms, 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 brief interlude of no worms, and now forever it's going to be worms. And for those of you who did not like worms, that's really too bad, because the worms are here. So I wanted to end this talk with, now that you've had my crazy projections, finish people saying things, and that is that hybrid warfare is a permanent part of our security environment. That means we have to get comfortable with all of these painful things and then bring them out in our societies. If you look at the Estonians, they straight up say, government is just another type of software. We back it up like we back up our software. We can run it from anywhere. They're like, our government runs on any hypervisor, basically, which is fascinating if you think about it. If there's a few things I think that are a little confusing. I've found it very interesting that if you look up cyber war, you get Russian propaganda in Finnish. So I think that's fascinating as well. I don't know why they've done that, but that's what they've done. So that is the talk. Hopefully people like this talk better than they liked the previous couple incarnations. Even though I feel like it wasn't necessarily the most coherent thing, it'll have a deeper coherence perhaps a couple years from now when more cyber war has happened. But anyway, thank you for listening. If you have comments and or just want to yell at me on the internet, you all know where I am.